Hey y'all,
What's going on, everyone?
I'm Jay,
And I'm Chris the Bird Nerd.
and we are
We are
the
the
Bird
Bird
Brains.
Brains. Hey, you know
All
what? On
right.
my end, dude, that one actually sounded pretty good. So
Oh, we were way off on my end. So,
I guess we'll see
we'll
who's
know,
right when we post
yeah,
it.
we'll check it out. That's funny. So, obviously, I'm in a hotel tonight, with less good internet than normal and less good lighting than normal. But the show must go on, as they say.
Very dedicated.
So, yeah, here we are at
All for you guys.
yeah, 10:30 at night my time, trying to get a
Yeah,
podcast knocked out.
I kept him up late. Had some late work meetings, so it's all my fault. But
Yeah,
Jay's paying the price for
I'm gonna
me.
tell my
So
mommy. Um, all right. So speaking of me whining, what are we gonna talk about today, Chris?
so I think we're gonna touch a little bit on cage setup and how to properly set up your cages, how to properly house your birds. And then for those that have bigger cages, aviaries, maybe some different aviary designs and setups in there, live plants, not live plants, perches, toys, think enrichment items. So I think we're going to touch base. I think we've got some good examples and some examples that probably could be improved upon that, I think many times novice or beginner bird breeders or bird keepers buy a little tiny cage, right? And think that their birds can go into it. And I think it's just they don't understand or realize that it's probably not the best, right? So touch base on that, what our recommendations are, what we feel like would be your minimal acceptable criteria of cages, and then just expound from that, hit up to the aviaries. So,
Yeah, and I mean, I'll also say this. I want to put this disclaimer at the front. If we start talking about bad things and you're like, "Oh no, that's me," this isn't a like you're terrible and you should get rid of your birds conversation. One of the things that we've talked about in the past, and I stand by, is we are the stewards of these animals, right? So it's our job to provide them the best housing possible and that in the best environment possible. And that doesn't just mean you set it up once and you're good. That means you're
yeah,
constantly looking for ways to improve it. So
absolutely.
if you're hearing this and you're like, oh no, I do all these things, this is a good, motivation for you to
Yeah,
make positive changes, right?
yeah.
Um, I mean, I
And
know that
I'll say right away, Jay, some of our bad examples that we're going to talk about, I've used in the past. It's
same.
a you live and you learn, and like you said, if I think if your end goal is to constantly evolve and to provide a better environment and location for your birds, that is really should be the purpose, right? Not just a one and done for the rest of the bird's life, but learning, looking at other people's setups and examples, and trying to provide a better environment. So
Absolutely. I mean, my wife would tell you. So we 2 summers ago, I in October of 22, I rebuilt my whole aviary, sort of chasing perfection like we're talking about. And that whole summer, I was planning it. And my wife and I were going on these walks. Um, we had a newborn, my son who's 2 now, and we were going on all these walks with our kids. And she wanted to talk about whatever, and I keep going back. I think I might do this. I think I might do this for months. And so yeah, I'm always thinking about what I can do to improve what I have, and then also next go around, how will I make it even better?
yeah,
Um, and then also I think so my priorities for cages, aviaries, bird keeping in general, number one, and I think I'm right on this, is what's best for the birds. And then number two for me is what's best for me cleaning and maintenance wise. So I'm
that's right.
trying to minimize my work because if it's impossible to do, it won't get done right. So trying to have the most efficient setup from a cleaning and maintenance perspective. And then, I mean, those are the two big things. And then I would say third is probably like presenting it. So like
Yeah.
viewability, kind of your display. But that's kind of a distant third for me.
Yeah, and
Um,
I would probably put in there as well, Jay, enrichment. Um,
mhm.
Being strategic on how you set these up, using all the items that you just talked about to help enrich the bird and, give it the most exercise that it possibly can, different types of whether it's toys or plants, etc., or specific places that you put perches to encourage the bird to fly more, right? To get as much exercise as it can. And putting toys in there. And when I say toys, I mean the right kind of toys because there can be the wrong kind of toys for birds that could harm them. But swings, things like that, putting them inside bushes, putting them on ends of perches. They like to play on them, things like that. So just ways that you can create a better environment for the birds overall. So
Right. And okay, so let's start there. Let's kind of go small to big, I think. We've talked about cage sizing before. I'll just touch that really quickly. So, general good rule of thumb is 1 square yard or 1 square meter roughly per pair. And I get lots of feedback and like almost like argumentative feedback, especially on Reddit, which is why what Reddit is for. But about minimum cage sizes. So, is it true that, for instance, zebra finches, you could keep zebra finch? I often joke I could breed zebra finches in a shoebox.
mhm.
It's true that you can keep them in a really small cage. Is that the best thing for them? No.
Right.
Um, think about if you had to live in a one-room house or a five-room house, which one would you rather live in, right? Everything else being equal, I'd rather live in the bigger house. So same thing for the birds. Um, so there's a lot of cages, and even some of the cages I have that you see, I've had people say, "Well, you have some cages that are smaller than that." That's true. My quarantine cages are smaller than that. However, the longest I keep birds in a quarantine cage is like maybe 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Uh, and even then, I don't love it. It's if I had more room to have bigger quarantine cages, I would. I'm very maxed out on space. I've literally got floor to ceiling cages with a tiny little hallway that I keep making smaller. Um, my last renovation, I put more cages on top of my existing cages. So
That's right. Yeah.
yeah, so I'm in a an urban cage setup at this point, right? I'm building a high rise. So, I think I would always say, if that's all you have room for, there's some great options to make bigger cages. And when I talk about that size, I'm always talking about the floor square footage, right? Because that's what's important for finches specifically. Now, hookbills, we can talk about that too, but that's not necessarily the same because they can climb. They use their beaks
Yeah.
for climbing. Finches don't really do that. So you're looking for the most travel that a
Yes.
bird can get. So you want the longest and deepest cage possible. Height is not as important. A 6 foot cage long that's only half a foot high would be better than a 3 foot cage long that's 3 feet high, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yep.
And then, so expanding out from there, no matter how big your cage is, in my aviary, for instance, that's 15 and some change feet long, I still have a perch all the way at one end and all the way at the other end. Now I have other perches different places, but if you look, my aviary has the inside section. It's kind of a T shaped with the top of the T being too long, but at the bottom of the T and each end of the T, there's a perch,
Yeah.
so that I have maximum flying distance, and those are the perches that I put in first. Those are the first ones I think about. So even in a small cage, even in my quarantine cages, a lot of bird cages will come with two perches going end to end.
Yeah.
I literally cut those with a saw and make them so that the birds can fly back and forth. Because if you just have the two end to end perches, you were calling it hopscotch earlier. You just have the two bird, the bird is just jumping back and forth and he might flap his wings one time kind of for balance. And that's
Yeah.
not exercise.
Yep. I
And over
agree. And
time, go ahead.
I was gonna say I have cages like that, right? So my smallest cages are. 3 feet long by, I think it's foot and a half tall, foot and a half wide, right? So it's longer than it is taller. And I will say that there are specific species of birds that breed better in individualized cages, which is one of the reasons why I still have it. My canaries breed very well in them. They are designed specifically for canaries. They divide into thirds, which you're dividing a 3 feet long cage into thirds. That's really small, right?
Right.
um, but there are some species that breed better. I try to keep the whole cage open if I can. There's every once in a while I'll breed one male canary to a couple females, but I never keep birds in there long term. It is strictly to breed. As soon as they're done breeding, they go back out to the big aviary, right? So I'm constantly rotating birds through because, I'll be honest, I see a difference when I pull those birds out after they're done breeding. They're a little bit heavier, right? They're obese because they haven't gotten that exercise that they would in, a bigger aviary setting or a bigger cage. So I try to keep and, stay on that rotation very well. But I have found that setup to be very valuable to me for certain species, but I would not recommend that if you have no other options and you're just planning to keep the birds in that cage for a while. It can be pretty taxing on them, and they'll get obese really quickly, especially certain species. I do keep my perches at the end of each cage so that they do have to fly to travel along, but yeah, it they're smaller cages, but I definitely try to rotate through and put them back into the aviaries. It's not a long-term solution, but more of a breeding for certain species.
Right, and it can cause, obesity, right, is the big problem, which then leads to like liver issues and stuff. And you got to remember how sensitive these birds are. The bird's
Right.
liver is tiny. It's a problem. And but it also causes like muscle atrophy, right? So like they can't fly as well. Then if you do go put them in a bigger cage, they struggle.
Yep.
They might not be able to get away from like a more aggressive bird or a mate that's kind of overbearing. It can lead to like plucking, pacing, things like that. It's not good long term. And yeah, like I said, I'm using them for quarantine now. I have holding cages that are 3 feet long or 4 feet long. Um, and I'll do that temporarily. But again, yeah, long term, all my birds are going to have a big area to fly. The shortest cage that I have that I keep birds in long term is 8 feet long. And
Nice.
even that, if I could figure out how to make it bigger, I would. I just don't have.
Yeah.
I mean, my cages literally go to where my doors don't open all the way anymore. So I've made them as big as I can. And I'll mention that here. If you're thinking, well, I can't find a longer cage online or I can't do that, we both have a bunch of videos about building cages.
Yeah.
Even if you are really a novice carpenter, uh, it is pretty easy to build a box. It doesn't have to be pretty. You can figure out how to be a finished carpenter later. I'm still not. If you looked at my cages really up close, you would see rough edges and things like that. It's not that important.
Yeah. Same.
Um, and then they also, there are other things that you could do. Like I've often thought about doing this, like buying like a bookcase. It's like 4 feet wide that has like pre-built-in shelves, and just making each one of those, screening off, and then putting a door at each end and making those into like breeder cages. So
Hmm.
there are options outside of buying cages off the internet. And oh, by the way, it's usually much cheaper to build your own. I mean, my first
Yeah.
flight cage was 1x2s and mosquito netting. It was an indoor only cage. And I think the whole cage cost me $50 and it was
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah.
So, and then you can also do things like make them fit around, let's say you have it in your garage and you need to have a freezer or something that fits under it. You can make an L-shaped cage with two bottoms. So you can get creative
Yeah.
with ways that you figure out to give your birds the maximum space.
And I know, Jay, for folks that are indoors, I know a lot of people have a smaller cage for the birds to sleep in and whatnot. And at certain times during the day, they've bird proofed their room and they let the birds fly free in the room, and then they go back into the cage to sleep at night. So there's other options out there
Mhm.
besides just buying a bigger cage. If you have the right setup, and you make it as safe as you possibly can, I think everything you do with a bird has its risks, right? So it's just looking at what those risks are, and trying to make a safe environment as much as you can. But I know a lot of people that do that, let their birds fly free around the room that the cage is in, and that's their exercise that they get. So there are some other options out there, instead of just upgrading to, this huge cage. So,
I will say, I want to emphasize there, bird proofing the room. And then also, like, we both have had stories, if you listen to the Heartbreaking Episodes podcast,
yeah,
of we were doing great, doing that method, and then messed up one time, and that's it. There's lots of stories of birds flying into pans on the
windows,
stove, birds flying into windows, birds flying doors, right? And another
ceiling
how
fans. Yeah,
ceiling fans, another pet getting in. Um, I'm sure there's other ones I'm not thinking. Oh, into toilets, an open toilet.
yeah.
Um,
Or you open the door to the room and they bolt out of there. And I've heard of a lot of people that their birds fly outside, right? Someone just opened up their
mhm.
front door and the bird saw an opportunity and took it and was gone. So yeah, definitely be careful.
Right. And so then I guess let's talk then about aviary design. And so one of the things I have in my aviary is a double door system.
Yes.
So just like you've seen at the zoo, I didn't invent this idea. Um, I've got the door to whatever cage, and then I've got my shed, and then there's a door on the front of the shed. And I'm very strict and careful. My kids are always trying to do it, and I always have to stop them. If I have any cage doors open, that door stays shut.
Yes.
So when I walk in, I shut the door, and then it's like, okay, now I can open a bird door. And so every once in a while, especially like young fledglings are real bad about this. You open the door to the aviary and a bird just shoots right past you. Well, if you have
Yep.
another door that can stop them and you have a bird safe area, that's great. You don't have to have a whole shed to do that. It's
Right.
just an easy way to do it. But I've seen, and like you, I think your old aviary had it. I know a bunch of people that have this. You can just build like basically a telephone booth. It just has to be big enough for you to get in, close one side, and then open the
Yep.
other side, right?
So
Um,
my current aviary has that. I built that
mhm.
for the outside portion. My last aviary that I had in our last house, I didn't have the double door system in my aviary. And I lost, I know off the top of my head, four birds that flew out when I was walking into the aviary. Two of those were Gouldian finches, right? So that was a big hit. And I was
Expensive.
like, I'm just watching this prize bird fly away into freedom. Um, but and I would say one thing along with that, Jay, is one thing that didn't help me in that last aviary, that I didn't have the double door system, but I also had their purchase. So the door was at the end of the aviary, right? It was a rectangle, so it was longer than it was wider. But I had my perches right above the door where I walked in. So the birds were just naturally landing there. And then if I had the door open and I'm walking in, and they would swoop down. And so placement of branches, making sure that you don't put them right next to your doors that you're walking in and out of, because that would just increase the chances of the birds being closer to the door and an opportunity to fly out when you're walking in or out, especially like you said, the young ones, right? The young ones, they're clumsy flyers, and they're usually flying into you as you're walking in the aviary. And then if they have a door
Right.
open, 9 times out of 10, they're usually flying out, not to escape, but just because they don't
It's
know how
kind
to
of by
fly very
accident.
good.
Yeah, they're
Yeah,
kind of just a runaway train. Yeah.
right.
Yeah, I mean, and I had two birds even with all that. I documented it last summer. I had a rodent get in, make a hole, and I had two birds get out of it. I was
Yeah.
very, very lucky to get those birds back. Um, w Basically, they were orange-cheeked waxbills, and I think it was a pair that got out, but they were kind of scared. And so I was out of town. I got back at like 1 a.m. and I ran out to the birdcage. My wife My daughter had noticed it. My wife then saw it, told me. I rushed home as fast as I could, and one of them was sleeping on the outside of the aviary on the bars. And I grabbed him in the night because when birds are sleeping, they're kind of in a trance sometimes. And I was able to catch that bird. And then I used that bird as bait to get his mate to come back and then trapped him. And I was I
Wow.
would have bet you a lot of money that that would not have been that outcome. But it was
Absolutely.
stressful and scary. And it, like we talked about before with improving, it led me to make a bunch of changes everywhere that previously I thought was untouchable by a rodent. I reevaluated. I ended up putting in, since that, I've put in a ton more metal mesh and a ton of concrete
Yeah.
um, in an effort to really even more rodent proof to not have that problem. Um, so let's talk about then, you kind of already talked about it, perch placement and setup. What are
Yeah.
some things when you're placing perches? What are some things that you're thinking about?
Yeah. And I would first say, Jay, I would use the same analogy that you did before with the cages. Longer is better than taller, right?
Hmm.
So if you have the space and the ability to, when you build an aviary, to make a long, I just think of a long rectangle uh, is usually better because, right? Because now your birds are getting more exercise. On my aviary, I did length and height. I did add more height to it than my wife wanted me to, but I liked it. It's nice. So they do have some of that height. So now they can. I mean, they travel probably about 20 feet from corner to bottom corner, right? Because I added that additional height, which can help too. So there are options there, but yeah, I keep that same analogy, Jay. A rectangle or length of flight is more important than height of flight. So keep that in mind. Perch placement, same thing. I try to strategically place my perches that encourages my birds to fly the most, right? Whether it's corner to corner, top to bottom, if they've got these big areas to fly. And really the goal in mind is what's the max amount of flight distance that I can get my bird to do if it's flying from one perch to the other. I would also say being strategic in how you place those perches. I try not to put one perch here and then another perch below it because then the birds just poop on that bottom one and you get this big buildup of poop and it gets dirty really quick. So trying not to overlap branches as best as I can. Obviously, there's some setups that it's hard to avoid. If you're putting in a tree that has a whole bunch of branches, it is what it is. But if you can try to strategically place where the birds would land and where their poop's going to land that make it easier to clean up and a little bit more sanitary. So I think that's, definitely something to keep in mind. Don't put your perches over your doors like I just talked about. It, makes it for a little bit easier escape out into freedom, having the double doors. So yeah, I think probably would be some of my initial ideas as far as just perch placement and branch setup. Oh, and probably the last thing, Jay, different varieties of branches and perches, right? So you want everything to, the bigger down to the really tiny small. We want the birds to be exercising their feet as much as they can. Obviously, that depends on the types of birds you have, right? Your bigger birds, you're going to want bigger perches, right? Your hook bills, your teeny tiny wax bills, like your orange cheek, you need some branches that are really small, right? And then some that are bigger. But yeah, getting that branch variety of size and width and diameter definitely helps in keeping a healthy foot for your bird. It exercises those muscles, strengthens their feet, and kind of gives them that variety as well.
Right, and they have there's a disease that birds can get called bumblefoot, and then they
Yeah,
can get like weird calluses and stuff if all their perches are the same. They're always, I mean, imagine if you always walked on your tiptoes, right? You'd get weird foot things going on. Same for birds. Um, so yeah, in the majority of my cages, I have natural perches. Um, as best I can. And if, in some cages, I do have dowel perches, or like in my parrot flight, I have a mix. But when I'm buying the dowels, I get different diameter dowels.
yeah,
And then I have natural perches in there too. So, but if I can, most of the time I'll try to use They're a little bit harder to mount in my parrot flight, but in the aviary, Uh, I only have like three dowel perches, um, and the rest are all. Uh, I like to use crepe myrtle branches because they're really long and straight typically. Like you were talking about, big long perches, and then um, you hit the nail on the head. One of the big things, and I redo my aviary every 6 months for hygiene and enrichment. So if you have to live in the same spot your whole life, be cool if it got remodeled every 6 months, right? And it's a new spot. So, um, or I guess not every 6 months, but usually at least once every, probably I'm doing it twice every year and a half. Um,
Yeah.
so I guess every 9 months. So usually right after breeding season, and then every once in a while. And then I also sometimes don't like the last one I did. And so I say, oh, I got to redo that.
Yeah.
And in fact, right now in my garage, I have a huge stack of perches. So every time I see like, oh, that's a good stick, I'll save it and let them start drying out of my garage. So in my garage now, I have a big pile of different perches for the next
Yep.
go round that'll happen after breeding season this year. And I've documented this on this channel and or on my YouTube and on Instagram a lot. But the so I think about the bird exercise, and then the next thing I think about is poop. So if you at the end of my aviary on the open side outside where I have my viewing chairs, if you look at it from the outside, it looks like I have three perches on top of each other. But if you look at it from the side, they're actually set up kind of like stadium seating.
Yep.
Um, and I do try not to overlap, and it's kind of unavoidable sometimes to have overlapping perches, but I try best I can not to have one perch hang over the other perch. And then I also, the way mine's set up is it's kind of like a rectangle within the rectangle of perches. So I have big long flight at the end, and then I have various feeding stations and stuff they can get to in the middle. But I really have none in the middle, if that makes sense. So I'm trying to
Yeah.
make them fly everywhere. And then
Yep.
over the door, like you talked about, and then also right next to the door is my water dish that has a like a flowing thing to it. If you looked at the rectangle of perches, there's like a gap over the door in the water dish. So it doesn't quite connect, and that's to prevent the birds or minimize. You can't stop birds from pooping in the water bowl, unfortunately, but it's to minimize
Yeah.
it. What you don't want is a bird to perch there all night. The small birds poop on average once every 20 minutes. So call it three an hour. So you have a bird for 12 hours sitting there. So that's 36 poops in that one spot. And so if that's over your water bowl, there goes your clean water.
And and for some reason, if the birds see a fresh, clean water dish, they go and poop in it every
Poop
time
time.
without fail. It drives me bonkers. But so Jay, we've talked about cage setup. We've talked about aviary setup design, placement of
Mhm.
perches. Got a few minutes left. Let's touch on plants. And if you're wanting to put plants in your aviary or inside your cages, if they're big enough, what recommendations would you have there?
Um, there's a lot of good options. So there's a few things I think about. So the first one is it bird safe, which there you can Google that. It's very easy. Make sure you're Googling the right plant, right? Because there's some where they're fine, and then there's some that are similar to that that are not bird safe. And what I mean by bird safe is if the bird ingests it, is it going to poison the bird? And
Yeah.
hookbill's much bigger concern because they're much more chewy and mouthy. With the finches, though, when they're making nests, certain species like my spice finches are really, they gnaw on a lot.
And your
You want to make,
canaries.
yeah, and your canaries, that's right. You want to make sure that you have plants in there that are safe. And then the flip side of that is you want to make sure you have plants that you either have to be willing to buy plants a lot, which you're kind of going to have to do that, or you have to have plants that can really hold up to the birds. So like I tried for a while like a camellia bush, and eventually every single leaf was gone and the bush died.
Yep.
So I only have one live plant And if you look at my aviary, it's all very green and bright and there's flowers. All of that is fake. It's either plastic or silk. Um, I have a giant palm plant in the middle, and I really like it. The birds use it for nesting material, and I like the jungle aesthetic that it gives.
Yep.
Um, and I actually have what you don't see if you're looking at any video. I actually have two of those plants in the same planter. So I have one that's in the aviary for 6 months, and the other one that's recovering for 6 months.
Nice.
And then right around the time the other one starts to look good, I swap them again. And then I have one that's all beat up, recovering, and the fresh one in there. And I still, about every 2 years, that the plant just ends up getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And by the end of about 2 years, it's time to chuck that plant and buy a new one.
Yep.
Um, Another thing I think about too is, so I'll wrap a lot of my perches in like fake ivy or fake vines. I'll actually go through when I'm doing that, and the leaves that hang horizontally right below the perch where they get pooped on, I'll pluck those leaves off of the fake plant.
Yep.
So I'm even going through by hand and clipping off the leaves that I know will accumulate poop. And the other ones still do, but not as rapidly. And so every time I redo the aviary, I'm replacing all those plants too.
I love that. One of the plants that I love to use, and I agree with you, Jay, right? The birds, they just destroy them if you've got real plants. Let's be honest. If you get enough plants in there and you don't have as many birds, you can last a little bit longer. But where I have a lot of birds and just a few plants that I put in there, I do like there's a bamboo variety that I buy here at my local nursery that I really enjoy because it has lots of branches that are strong enough to hold most of my birds, and the stalks are, strong enough. My canaries have about half of that plant de-leaved. They pull most of the leaves off within about a week. Um, but it's really hardy and it still shoots out new leaves every year. And then I usually try and get like the long grassy plants that,
Mhm.
most of them are not toxic to your birds. And the birds love to hide in them. They love to pull them for nesting material, and they tend to do well in our really hot summers that we have here in Utah. And so, um, I am putting a few different picture clips and video clips throughout this to give you guys an idea of some of the different aviary setups, the different plants. So huge shout out to Aladdin. What is it?
Ohana feathers, I
Ohana
think, or
Feathers,
Ohana,
thank
I think
you.
it's Ohana feathers. Yeah.
Yeah, sent me a couple pictures and videos of his aviary. I've got a couple videos of Jay's aviary, my aviary, my brother's. So just to give you guys different ideas of how to utilize live and fake plants throughout, which I think it's really good, right? When I put my fresh plants in there at the beginning of spring, it completely changes the behavior of my birds. They go to this next level of enrichment, engagement, curiosity. I mean, they're climbing upside down on some of these things. Some of my birds, right, and hiding in the grasses, eating the leaves. So it really is. I feel like a very important piece to bird keeping. And whether you use live plants or fake plants, I think it can give the same result, right? I think it just changes the scenery. It gives them something new. It feels more of a natural environment for humans to look at and observe, but
Yeah, it
also for the
looks
birds
cool.
to
Yeah.
live in. Yeah, so I think plants are really cool and definitely an added plus to any cage or aviary, and especially if you're trying to breed. Sometimes plants are necessary, right, to give the birds
Yeah,
privacy and whatnot, and can be beneficial
that's
to
what I
them.
was about to say. There's some species, a lot of your African species, your jungle species, like a lot of your parrot finches and stuff. They are like forbs, especially. They are really a lot more comfortable in like a densely planted aviary, whether it's real or fake. And then another thing I'll do is I'll intentionally hang like fake vines or like one thing I love to do is right after Christmas, I'll go to the department stores and they're selling
Oh
the
yeah.
Christmas decorations that people didn't buy for really cheap, and I'll just buy it all. Um, and so I'll intentionally kind of put that at the mouths to some of the boxes and the cages so they kind of feel like they're tucking back in. And then I'll hang it, like if I have a long straight perch, I'll split that perch into thirds with hanging vines. So even if birds are sharing a perch, they're able to have a little privacy.
Yeah,
And I've
I
got
love that.
privacy perches too, which is a great way to help birds not be stressed. But
Yes.
that's another trick, and it looks a lot more natural than the privacy perches. I kind of try to hide my privacy perches because they don't look super natural. But the another way to do that is with greenery, right? And a bird can just, okay, you're picking on me, you're picking on me. I'm going to go over here, and now you can't see me. And if you
Yeah,
can't see me, you're not going to bug me.
absolutely. I
Hmm.
agree.
Yeah. So overall, you're looking for the most flight possible. You're looking for, oh, and one more thing I do want to add, especially if you have multiple birds in the same cage or the same aviary, you want to have multiple water stations, multiple
Yeah.
food stations. So,
Yes.
and that just is going to help deter aggression. And if you get one bird
Yes.
that gets real territorial or decides to nest right next to the food bowl and chase all the other birds away, doesn't cause you a problem. In my big aviary, for example, I have one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight food stations
Nice.
uh, in there. So,
I've only got three in mine, but yeah, three per each flight, right?
so,
Aviary. So
so six, right? Or I guess, yeah. So you have split, I don't. But
yeah.
um, so those are all just things to consider. And another thing I'll add here at the end, steal ideas from people. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
every time I look at someone's aviary, I'm evaluating, oh, is that something I want to incorporate? Um, Charles Cole, I'll give an example. He's a great listener. He's the was the winner of the mug.
Yeah.
He built an indoor aviary that looks really cool. He's got a lot of fake vines in there. It looks great, but he built his frame out of PVC. And I
Oh,
thought, man,
nice.
that's a good way to do it because it's easy to screw into. You can
Uh-huh.
build like a PVC box in a room and you're not making any holes in the walls. And it's also waterproof, obviously, very easy to clean, bird safe. So that was an interesting way to do it. Um,
Nice.
yeah, so that was something I thought of. And I mean, I every time I'm watching somebody else's bird video, I'm thinking of how do I want to do this compared to so and so? And like I've gotten ideas from you, um, Tony Arnold. I mean, tons of people I've
Yeah.
stolen ideas from, especially like how I want to set up nests and where I want to put things. And then I know people have used my ideas, and that I want people to do that, right? So I spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about this, how to do it right, how to do it better. So if someone
Yep.
wants to piggyback off of me, like, yes.
Yep. Variety is key. Be strategic and be okay to change it up every year, right?
It's
Your
good to
birds
change it
love
up.
it. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's good, right? Your birds love it. People love it. Like, I think all round, you can't go wrong with those. So I think those keep in mind if you got one little cage, hopefully not that little, after this discussion,
right.
or a big giant aviary. Keep looking for ways to add that variety, that strategy, and how to keep the birds, as mobile as you possibly can, and and as enriched as you possibly can too. So,
Absolutely. All right, Chris, where can they find you if they have a question about this?
yep, all things bird nerd. Facebook, Instagram, YouTube are the main platforms that I use. Bird nerd for Instagram, but they all have the same logo. So if you type in bird nerd, the odds of you finding me are pretty high. Yeah, good place to go. How about you, Jay?
Yep. So again, yeah, same thing. So Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. I'm also on Threads, which is terrible. I'm on Reddit. Um, if the javiary at gmail.com, if you really want to send me an email question, if you have a really long one. I try to respond to DMs pretty quickly. I mean, I think there's a lot of people listening that I've now talked to. And one cool thing about the podcast is I've definitely gotten to talk to more people. Um, but yeah, reach out if you have a question, drop a comment down here, shoot us a DM. If you're trying to ask Chris something and you can only find me, like I'll help you find Chris or vice versa. It's
Yeah,
like we
exactly.
obviously talk all the time. We're able to help each other out. It's what I love to do. So reach out, you know, keep working to improve what you got going on.
Yep, I agree.
Mhm. All right. Well,
Okay.
I think that's it. We'll catch you on the next one.
Appreciate you guys. We'll see you.